So, first and foremost, I think, I'd like to thank all the, nephrologists and physicians who have joined us for this very interesting meeting. Let me tell you first, I think I always love cross specialty collaborative meetings. I think that's the one which in fact, that is something, I'd like to see more often in future. For endocrinologists talking to other endocrinologists or nephrologists talking to other nephrologists, it's always better that one specialty talks to another on an open forum. What that does is that, we kind of learn the recent developments from other specialties. Most of us, know are well abreast with what's happening in our specialty, but we are often, after finishing our MD, we often lag behind about what's the new development in other specialties. And being, students of internal medicine, all of us, I think we need to really, at least know what's going on in the other specialty so that we can manage our patients better. But at end of the day, our patient really does not identify. They just want to be better, right? It does not matter whether it's a nephro related problem, it's an endo related problem, or it's a cardiology related problem. I think at end of the day, our task is to make our patients better. So always, I strongly encourage, and I respect and really enjoy cross specialty meetings. And in this meeting also, I think, I would love to be a student as well as, to teach something. It would be great, but I would also like to learn a lot from you. So I think that is something, which will be my ultimate aim, that, not only just to tell you a few things, but to learn a couple of things from you as well. So I think that's what's my goal for today's talk. So we'll discuss about the diagnosis and the management of osteoporosis in patients with chronic kidney disease. Okay, so let's first start with the diagnosis part. So this lecture has two parts. First is the diagnosis. So let's first establish the diagnosis. So, first and foremost, we need to understand, I think, osteoporosis is extremely, in today's era, it's an extremely under treated, under reported, and under recognized chronic disorder, right? So we have now a very aging population. We have a population which is now constantly, living longer and longer, and with increased longevity comes wear and tear, comes degeneration. And the bone, which is the basis of our fundamental basis of our entire framework, entire architecture, is the one which rapidly undergoes degeneration with aging. And a lot of it is contributed by the aging itself, right? So the age itself contributes to this factor of, decline in the renal, decline in the bone function. But at the same time, there are other factors which contribute to the same. So again, the first question is, how do you diagnose osteoporosis? First question is, what exactly is osteoporosis, before we come to diagnosis. Now, remember, osteoporosis is just it's more of a technical definition rather than a true pathological definition. It's something like hypertension. This is something which I think all of us need to understand this fundamental. If we understand this fundamental very well, we might be doing better with all chronic diseases. So, if you talk about osteoporosis, we define osteoporosis based on a BMD DEXA, or a bone mineral density DEXA scan. Now, the DEXA scan, what it does is it compares the bone mineral content of a particular person with that of a young individual of the same sex. So, for example, if I am doing a DEXA scan of my father, who is a 68-year-old person, so I do a DEXA scan, his bone mineral content, whatever value that I get, let's say 0.8, right? It is then compared to my nephew, who is 25 years old, young man, right? So 25-year-old nephew of mine, who is, at the peak of his bone, right? So my father's bone age is compared to that of my nephew. So in that sense, what we are seeing is how bad is the bone situation for it to break. So that is what basically we are doing when you do a DEXA scan. So what we are doing is we are comparing with a gold standard. The gold standard being a young individual of the same sex. That's the idea, right? So if I'm saying that my father has osteoporosis, what it means is that my father's bone mineral content is minus 2.5 standard deviation worse than that of my nephew, who is a young 25-year-old chap. So this is very similar to what we do with other numerical parameters. For example, if you talk about blood pressure, so when do I say a person is having hypertension? When we take the blood pressure of the entire population, and if somebody's blood pressure is more than 2 standard deviation above the general population, that means the patient's blood pressure is high, and that would classify as hypertension. Same with, I would understand with creatinine, for example. If you take a creatinine of a particular age group, particular weight, particular lean body mass individual, compare it, and if you find that one person's creatinine is 2 standard deviation above the general population, it means that it is high. If you talk about blood sugars, right? If you talk about diabetes mellitus, again, it's the same thing. So at the end of the day, what we are basically doing is we are comparing to a standard, and in bone mineral density, the standard is that of a young person of the same age and sex. So the next question is then, can you use BMD DEXA for diagnosis of osteoporosis in CKD patient? Answer is not as simple as you think it is. Answer is, when the GFR is less than 30, then the DEXA BMD is not reliable. Whereas when the GFR is more than 30, you can easily use DEXA BMD for the diagnosis of osteoporosis. Now, why this conflict? Why this problem? Because you are all nephrologists, and I think you understand this fundamental, that when you have declining eGFR and when you go to higher grades of CKD, you are now then dealing with a disease which is known as CKD MBD, right? So that is chronic kidney disease, metabolic or mineral bone disorder or metabolic bone disease. So when you're going with the lower GFR, you are dealing with a CKD MBD in addition to the osteoporosis itself. Classically, osteoporosis is a disease of degeneration. It's a disease of aging. That is what is primary osteoporosis. But when you have an additional metabolic bone disease itself, the bone itself has some other disease process which is involved, then it is very difficult to use DEXA to make a diagnosis of CKD or make a diagnosis of osteoporosis. So that's one important fundamental we should try and understand. To give you another example, let me say that I'm sitting in my OPD and I'm doing a routine health checkup. So you see all these hospitals. My hospital also does this package, right? So you do a complete health checkup package, and in this complete health checkup package, somebody gets a DEXA scan done. So let's say there's a 60-year-old female who gets a DEXA scan done as a part of the package. Now I see the patient's vitamin D level, and the vitamin D level is 9, and the patient's DEXA scan is showing osteopenia. So does this patient actually have osteopenia, or do I still need an evaluation? The answer is I still need an evaluation, because remember, when I'm again comparing the DEXA, what I'm also assuming that all the other parameters which could potentially impact the bone, primary parameters, have been taken care of. So again, the analogy which I gave about my father, if I'm doing the DEXA scan of my father should have vitamin D deficiency corrected. Only then I'll get the real picture of the DEXA. So in the same way, when I often see these patients in OPD, what we do is, patient with severe vitamin D deficiency, we first correct the vitamin D deficiency. And after a few months, when the vitamin D deficiency is corrected and the patient is vitamin D replete, after that we repeat the DEXA. And in lot of the times, this osteopenia often comes down to normal BMD. So the point here I'm trying to make is that again, whenever you are dealing with an intrinsic bone disease, so again vitamin D produces a situation of secondary hyperparathyroidism, the deficiency of vitamin D itself produces a bone disorder. When you have this situation, then DEXA falls apart. DEXA is not very reliable. So generally speaking, when you are dealing with a patient with a GFR less than 30, in that situation, you may not use DEXA. You can use other parameters. We'll see what we can use. So DEXA is not a very reliable tool in that situation. You can still consider doing it, but again, it's not a very reliable test in that case. But again, when you're dealing with CKD more than 30, eGFR more than 30, and when you're dealing with patients who are otherwise vitamin D replete, all these normal situations are taken care of. In such a situation, a DEXA scan is particularly useful. So before you interpret or you look at the DEXA report, like I told you, you need to look at other parameters. You need to look at the patient's calcium. You need to look at the phosphorus. you need to do a PTH, you need to do a vitamin D, and you need to do a alkaline phosphatase. And if all these situations are reasonably corrected, I'm sure we'll not be able to correct every single thing all the time in real life practice. If these things are reasonably corrected, after that it would be a better idea to do a DEXA rather than to do a DEXA before, when a patient already comes with severe vitamin D deficiency or severe secondary hyperparathyroidism. So it's always a good idea to screen the patient after the other underlying conditions have been reasonably corrected to some extent, and after that you can consider doing the DEXA. Now let me put this in another way. A patient comes to you with a fragility fracture. So let's say there is an elderly gentleman with CKD, right? Let's say the age is 68, 69. So the patient is having chronic kidney disease, not on dialysis. Now the patient goes to the bathroom and he slips and he falls and develops a fracture neck femur. So this is what is considered a fragility fracture. So fragility fracture is when you fall from a standing height and still develop a fracture, right? So you and me, if we fall in the bathroom, will not develop fracture. If we fall playing football, we'll still not develop fracture, right? If we play, if a ball hits us when playing cricket, it will not have a fracture. But those patients who have osteoporosis have a risk of what is known as fragility fracture. That is, they are walking and suddenly there is something, a child's toy which is there on the way, So Gharma Dadaji hai, and Dadaji is walking and Dadaji trips over the child's toy and Dadaji develops a fracture neck femur. Or Dadiji is going on a bumpy ride to some religious destination, and the road is very bad, right? And on the road, there are a lot of bumps, there are a lot of breaks and a lot of ups and downs. And when she travels back and forth and does all the all the yatra of all the dhams, and she comes back, she has severe back pain, and you do an X-ray or you do a CT or you do an MRI and you find that she has multiple vertebral fractures. That is osteoporosis for sure, right? And when you have a fragility fracture, you don't need to do a BMD DEXA scan to diagnose osteoporosis. This is something which you should try and understand. I often see, of course, you can do it to document the thing, that what was the baseline BMD of this patient, because when you're treating the patient, you would like to follow up it up. But purely speaking, you should not wait for a DEXA scan in patients with fragility fracture to really make a diagnosis of osteoporosis. I often compare osteoporosis with myocardial infarction. In fact, myocardial infarction is currently, I'm sure, the leading cause of death worldwide. But fracture neck femur or osteoporotic fractures, especially femur fractures, are also within the top 5 causes of death in elderly population. In fact, in females, a fracture neck femur has higher mortality compared to breast cancer. Right? Can you believe it? So in terms of mortality statistics, a fracture neck femur is more likely, has a higher mortality rate than breast cancer in today's era. So it's a important deadly condition, right? It's not something we just, which produces morbidity. It also produces mortality. And when you're dealing with a situation in such a scenario, I think it's easily equated to other serious conditions like perhaps a myocardial infarction. So we often screen our CKD patients or diabetic patients for myocardial infarction. We regularly do a ECG, a stress test, a echocardiography, sometimes an angiography, right? We strive to diagnose cardiovascular disease early. But what we forget is that underlying, the patient may not die of a heart attack. The patient may die of a fracture neck femur, then a complication secondary to that, secondary infection during the hospital, and may have a mortality due to that, right? So we also need to give equal importance to the bone. And again, bringing the comparison of osteoporosis and heart attack. Like I said, when you have a fracture, a fragility fracture, you don't need to do a DEXA scan to establish that the patient is having osteoporosis. It's the same way in which patient already comes with myocardial infarction. Do you need to do a lipid profile or do you need to calculate the patient's cardiovascular risk score? Answer is no. Why? Because patient already had an heart attack, right? The risk, the proof is already there in the pudding, right? Already it has happened. What's the point of them calculating the risk score? So again, in the same way, a DEXA scan is a risk score. It's a risk factor, right? It's a risk factor. It will tell you the probability of a fragility fracture. But if the patient already develops a fragility fracture, then the patient already has osteoporosis. You don't need a further test to make the diagnosis. So that is something you need to really keep in mind. Now, one more issue which is often complicated in CKD patients is the involvement of parathyroid, PTH. Right now, PTH is one hormone which both endocrinologists and nephrologists are in close contact with. This is one thing which often binds us together, I would say. So what is the role of PTH in distinguishing the various types of bone disease in CKD? So I think PTH is a very useful test to really see what type of bone disease you are seeing in a CKD patient. And this is very important because ultimately when you want to give the therapy or when you want to decide what kind of therapeutic intervention you'll do in your CKD patient, you need to really see two contrasting situations. One is a high turnover bone disease when you have secondary or even sometimes tertiary hyperparathyroidism and the patient's bone turnover is faster. In such a situation, you will have to reduce the bone turnover. And the other parallel is something known as an adynamic bone disease, which is also seen in CKD patients, as you are very well aware. So in such patients, again, what you're doing is that the bone turnover is actually less, right? And you have, in such a situation, you might have to develop an alternate strategy to look at the patient's bone condition. So typically speaking, when you do a PTH, and if the PTH, this has been shown in several studies, when the PTH is more than 585, right? This comes from one or two trials. This is generally associated with a high turnover. When the PTH is more than 585, this is generally associated with a high turnover bone disease. But in a patient with CKD, when the PTH is less than 100, then you are more likely to be dealing with an adynamic bone disease rather than a high turnover bone disease. So again, your strategy for management of both these patients would differ. And this type of patient will do well with today's talk. We are going to talk about denosumab. So these patients will actually do well with denosumab, whereas these patients, denosumab may not be a very good idea because patient is already having adynamic bone disease and giving a anti-resorptive action drug will actually make the situation perhaps worse. So PTH, again, just one value is not a good thing. Perhaps a trend of PTH is more useful, and PTH trends are more useful than measuring the PTH alone. So which other marker apart from PTH is also useful in differentiating adynamic bone disease from high turnover bone disease? Another useful test is known as bone specific alkaline phosphatase. Now this is available in some labs. In Ahmedabad it is available in Lal Path Lab, as I understand. Right. I'm sorry for taking commercial names, but just as a practical point, if you want to do this, it's available in Lal Path Lab. So you can do a bone specific alkaline phosphatase, BSAP. BSAP, why bone specific alkaline phosphatase? Because this is mainly produced by osteoblasts. So naturally it's a marker of bone formation, right? So it means that the more the bone is formed, the more osteoblasts will take part and more BSAP will be produced. So and again, it's not cleared by kidney. So again, it's a good marker in patients with CKD. So using BSAP, if the bone specific alkaline phosphatase is less than 33, this suggests a low turnover bone disease, whereas it's more than 42, it suggests a high turnover bone disease. So this again is a very useful test which you can do in patients with your chronic kidney disease. Again, this patient with BSAP of more than 40, this patient will do well with denosumab, whereas this patient may not be a very good candidate for denosumab. So I think this is something we should keep in mind while prescribing a potential therapy. So we talked about the diagnosis part and some take-home messages from the first part of the talk. Remember, DEXA BMD is not a reliable test in patients with GFR less than 30. The presence of fragility fracture itself is diagnostic of a bone pathology. Test will only confirm the etiology, but the patient already has a osteoporosis and patient generally needs treatment before we consider more expensive tests. And in patients with CKD, you need to distinguish whether the patient has a high turnover bone disease or low turnover bone disease to decide further therapy and further management. And PTH and BSAP are very useful tests for establishing the same. So that was the first part of the lecture, that is the diagnostic part. Now let's come to the management of osteoporosis in patients with CKD. So first and foremost, what should be the calcium and vitamin D intake for this patient? This is again a frequently asked question in most of us. So generally speaking, 1200 milligram of calcium daily must be given, and this is basically total diet plus supplement. So total calcium should be 1200 milligram. So to give you a context, one glass of milk gives you 200 milligram of calcium, of elemental calcium. So one glass of milk or one bowl of dahi will give you 200 milligram of calcium. So unless our patient is drinking 6 glasses of milk every day, the patient will not be getting adequate calcium. So in some of these patients, you will have to give calcium supplements. Again, vitamin D, 800 international units daily should be given, at least 800 international units should be given in this group of patients. Okay, but remember, of course, we need to keep vascular calcification in mind, right? And this is again something, a separate area of debate. So I think this is not something we'll be discussing too much in detail today. I think we can discuss separately in some other talk. Can these patients develop hypercalcemia, right? We need to understand this. Remember, when GFR is more than 60, hypercalcemia is generally seen only when patient's vitamin D level is more than 150, right? So don't worry about giving 800 international units a day, because patient developing hypercalcemia would only occur in very, very severe vitamin D toxicity. We have seen such patients. But patients with lower GFR, they can develop hypercalcemia even with lower levels of vitamin D, right? And in such situations, you need to be careful and you need to really assess the patient on case by case basis. Again, can just making the bones stronger prevent a fracture? That's a $1 million question, right? So this is like saying, right? This is like saying, can just giving statins to a patient with high cardiovascular risk reduce the risk of myocardial infarction? Answer is no. Why? Because myocardial infarction is a multifactorial disease. So what are the factors contributing to myocardial infarction? You have dyslipidemia, which is corrected by statins. Diabetes may be a cause, hypertension may be a cause, CKD may be a cause, smoking may be a cause, high, strong family history would be a cause. So all these things contribute towards myocardial infarction, right? Now it's not just dyslipidemia. In the same way, when I'm talking about a fracture, it's not just the DEXA scan or BMD which will contribute to the fracture. There will be multiple other factors which will contribute to the same. So like I said, vitamin D deficiency, the calcium status of the patient, and very importantly, when you're talking of older elderly people, the risk of fall, right? So if the patient has poor vision, he's more likely to fall. If the patient has vitamin B12 deficiency, which again, increases risk of neuropathy, again the patient is more likely to fall. So when I'm talking about risk of fracture, again we are not dealing with just a situation of just osteoporosis. We need to see this in a more global way, in a multifactorial way. So muscles again are equally important, right? And patients with, especially patients who are old, they tend to have sarcopenia, which have the muscles are weak, and weak muscles means more likelihood of falling. So all these things would also contribute equally. And of course, one thing you should always do in your patients, especially older group of patients, right? Now we have a lot of people practicing internal medicine, subspecializing into geriatrics. So all of us, as nephrologists, as endocrinologists, as cardiologists, we are definitely seeing oncologists. We're all seeing elderly population. We are all seeing. So we need to be part geriatric or gerontologists also, apart from being just good physicians, because we need to understand specific needs of the elderly population. And again, sarcopenia is a very important thing, and a simple test to see whether your patient has sarcopenia. So what you do, you ask the patient to get up from the chair without using the side arms, right? So just ask him to, put your hand this way and try to get up from the chair. If the patient can get up from the chair with this simple maneuver, the patient has reasonably good muscle strength. Mind you, a lot of patients of yours will not be able to do this. This patient will be sarcopenic, and this patient would be at a risk of fall, right? So this is something you should be aware about, and this should be again told to your patient and talk with your patient. So next time when you see a elderly patient in your clinic, just when they're sitting, just ask them to get up without using their hands, and you'll be able to quickly check the muscle strength. Okay, again, which other endocrine issues you need to sort out in this patient? Again, a lot of these patients would be hypogonadal, especially male. So of course females will always be hypogonadal, you know that, because they are menopausal, postmenopausal. But again, hypogonadism in males also contributes, especially obese individuals. So obese elderly people tend to be more likely to be hypogonadal. They also have obesity associated hypogonadism. This also contributes to the bone loss in such patients, and all these things has to be taken into account. Of course, this is one, right? And of course, in young women, if you have evidence of hypogonadism, and in young men, you should consider evaluating this. Send this patient to endocrinologist. We'll evaluate these patients, and then we'll consider for further management based on that. And in fact, in patients with hypogonadism, especially younger patients with hypogonadism, it is better to correct the hypogonadism. That will have more contribution to improvement of the general well-being of the patient as well as the bone strength of the patient, rather than giving specific osteoporosis medicine. So this is something you should keep in mind. Hence, all these patients, it would be a good idea when you're dealing with a patient with osteoporosis, it would be a good idea to first do a good endocrine consultation, rule out secondary causes which could contribute to osteoporosis, and you will be surprised. In fact, apart from this, a lot of patients, would be on alternative medications which may contain glucocorticoid like effect, so they can sometimes have steroids, right? So patients can be Cushingoid, patients can have Cushing syndrome, patients could have hyperthyroidism. So a lot of cases where there could be other causes of osteoporosis, primary hyperparathyroidism, of course, you will be, evaluating. So all these things, secondary causes need to be looked at, and they also need to be corrected before you consider treatment. So the first primary thing is, when you see your patient, just don't concentrate on the BMD DEXA report. Look at the other things which could contribute. Look at primary hyperparathyroidism, look at thyrotoxicosis, look at hypogonadism, look at Cushing syndrome. All these things could potentially contribute to the patient developing osteoporosis and in future fractures. Okay, so the next question is about the management itself. So osteoporosis in CKD, whether to treat or not to treat. Well, let's look at this in a schematic manner. So broadly speaking, when you have patients with GFR more than 30, again, these patients have reasonably good longevity, and this patient should be treated like just any other patient you treat. So any usual patient with osteoporosis, the same way we treat them, most cases of this should be treated the same way. But when you have GFR less than 30, look if the patient has history of fragility fracture. If the patient has a past history of fragility fracture, right, then you again look at the GFR. If the GFR is less than 15, patient is end-stage renal disease, you're not going to get too much benefit out of treating this patient, so you can just wait and watch. But if the patient has 15 to 30 eGFR, rule out renal osteodystrophy, rule out CKD metabolic bone disease, CKD MBD, and then if you ruled it out, treat the patient. On the other hand, if the patient has no history of fragility fracture, in this group of patient, you can just follow up this patient, and you can again, look at the potential of whether, the risk is risk-benefit ratio in terms of treatment. Okay, so now next comes the question of which drug to use, what drug to use for treatment. So if you see broadly, there are two groups of drugs which are used for treatment. So you have anti-resorptive drugs and you have bone anabolic agents. So there's one group of drug which prevents the breakdown of bone, and then there's another group of drug which helps in formation of the bone. So the drugs which prevent breakdown of the bone are very popular, are bisphosphonates, right? So bisphosphonates are extremely well known. So you have alendronate, risedronate, all very popular. Calcitonin also easily available in India, reasonably popular among spine surgeons, but not very in general public. It's not very popular. In females, estrogen and progesterone are also options, especially young female with primary ovarian insufficiency. You can consider giving them estrogen, progesterone. And again, selective estrogen receptor modulus, SERMs, especially raloxifene, has good data as far as bone or as far as osteoporosis management is concerned, but they are better for prevention of osteoporosis rather than for treatment of osteoporosis. So SERMs are good, but they generally tend to have more preventive rather than treatment role. When you talk about bone anabolic agents, the drug which we have is teriparatide. Again, I am sure as nephrologists you are well aware about it. It's a recombinant PTH. It's a recombinant molecule of PTH. And then of course, in India we don't have any other drugs of this class, but again, this is something which you have in future. You'll have abaloparatide, which is PTHRP analog, and so on and so forth. So we'll have more therapies in this group, but right now the only drug we have per se is basically teriparatide. And then of course, vitamin D analogs like your cinacalcet, your calcitriol, etc. may have a mixed action both on anabolism as well as catabolism. Right. So again, these are the two classes of drugs. So you have anti-resorptives and anabolics. The problem with anabolics is that especially in CKD patients or patients with prior cancer, they are not very safe to use. So again, you should be careful about using it. And teriparatide, right now we have data for only 2 years. In fact, now you had recently in the recent endocrine society meeting, you had data published for 36 months. So now you can extend it for more than 2 years. So you have safety data for a longer period of time. Anti-resorptive drugs have its own class of problems, and this, remember, don't use this in patients with low turnover bone disease. So patients with low turnover, do not use anti-resorptive drugs. Okay, so what we need to do is we need to find a balance between safety and compliance and efficacy, and this is where denosumab really comes into picture, right? So I'll tell you what, I've used denosumab in a lot of patients, and right now it is my go-to drug, though it's on the expensive end. Now, with the use of biologicals, or biosimilar agents, denosumab is now much cheaper and much affordable to a lot of extent. So denosumab right now is currently one of my favorite drug which I use in osteoporosis in general. So in all patients, so whenever I see osteoporosis patient, we first offer them denosumab. The reason is actually, for me, the reason is actually convenience. The thing about denosumab is that the thing with other anti-resorptive drugs or other drugs in general, see, teriparatide, excellent group of drug, but the problem is it's an injectable which has to be taken daily. A lot of patients do not take it. First thing. Second, if you talk about drugs like alendronate, it has to be taken weekly. It is a very inconvenient way of taking, right? It has to be taken on an empty stomach, so on and so forth. A lot of patients don't understand how to take it, and then they stop taking it because they don't understand why it is given in first place. Then you have the injectable bisphosphonate like zoledronate. Now, zoledronate is a great drug. It has to be given once a year, very simple to administer. So you put the patient in daycare and administer the zoledronate to the patient. The problem with zoledronate is that zoledronate is extremely, first dose, patient is extremely unpleasant. It's a very unpleasant drug. Patient develops fever. We tell this patient you will develop fever, patient will 100% develop fever, and fever often lasts for 5-6 days, which is quite inconvenient. If you talk about, even generally if you develop, routine fever, if you get dengue fever, it's what, 5-6 days you will have fever, right? I mean, that's pretty long, to develop a drug fever after, zoledronate for 5 to 6 days. Manufacturer says 1 to 2 days, but generally it lasts for 5 to 6 days. I've seen often in practice. So it's a very inconvenient drug to administer. Now, of course, with biosimilars in that group also, you have cheaper zoledronate easily available now in India. So denosumab is a very simple drug. It has absolutely no side effects. I have never had any patient complain of any major side effects after denosumab. Only thing, you have to monitor the calcium, which of course, we will be doing. So denosumab typically is a subcutaneous agent given every 6 monthly and very easy to give and does not produce any major side effect. So what exactly is denosumab? Now, to understand denosumab, let me give you a very simple concept. So see, the bone has a cycle. It's known as a bone turnover cycle. So what happens is you have osteoblast which cause bone formation, and this osteoblast also activate osteoclasts which cause bone breakdown, and this bone breakdown further stimulates bone formation. So it's a cycle. So bone formation stimulates breakdown, breakdown stimulates formation. This is the typical cycle. So all of us, you and me, all of us has this bone cycle, bone turnover going on. This bone turnover is necessary to keep the bone strong and to keep it healthy, and to, of course, keep, the bone is a very flexible structure. So to keep changing, as our ages advances, or there could be some injury, or there could be some other, postural changes, all these things, the bone constantly is in a motion of change. It constantly is changing. It is constantly turning over. Now, as the age advances, the problem is that the bone formation lags behind the bone breakdown. So more bone breakdown is faster than the bone formation, and because of that, you tend to have osteoporosis or tend to have weak bones. Again, in certain conditions, you will have more bone, in pathological conditions like, for example, hyperparathyroidism. Again, hyperparathyroidism, the entire bone turnover cycle is rapidly enhanced, and when you have the entire cycle rapid, in that situation always, so whenever you are making things faster, you're more likely to have more wastage also. So in the same way, when you have a rapid bone turnover, again the breakdown is generally more than the formation, and that's why patients with primary hyperparathyroidism tend to develop osteoporosis. So this is what happens. So both the cycles are linked together. Now, how does this link actually happen? It happens through something known as a rank and rank ligand pathway. So, osteoblasts or osteocytes, they produce rank, which acts on a rank ligand which is present on it produces a rank ligand which acts on a rank receptor which is present on the osteoclast, right? So the osteoblast produced rank which acts on the osteoclast and it stimulates the osteoclast. So what denosumab does is, denosumab, it actually competes with the rank ligand and it prevents the rank ligand from binding with the receptor or the rank receptor present on the osteoclast. So it acts as a competitive inhibitor of this. So it's an antibody basically. So it acts as a competitive inhibitor. So what it does is, it prevents the osteoblast or the osteocyte from activating osteoclast. So bone formation is taking place, but the corresponding breakdown which should take place is not taking place. So this cycle is broken. So more formation takes place and less breakdown. The consequence of that, the adverse consequence of that is that by breaking this cycle, you are actually reducing the turnover of the bone. So by reducing the turnover of the bone, you are creating a adynamic situation. However, in most of the patients with advanced age, in general, so if you're not talking about CKD patients, in general, most patients tend to have a high turnover situation because of secondary hyperparathyroidism, and because of that, by giving denosumab, you actually slow down this process of high turnover, right? So this is how denosumab acts, and denosumab acts, it's a little different compared to, we'll not go into too much detail of this compared to osteoporosis, right? But it's now considered a first line agent in management of osteoporosis, right? Okay, so what are the indications for use of denosumab in conventional practice? It is of course indicated for postmenopausal osteoporosis. It is again also indicated for osteoporosis in men, right? It is very useful in patients with cancer therapies, like patients with androgen deprivation therapy for non-metastatic prostate cancer patients. We had this one patient who is on denosumab for a long time for this indication. Women with on aromatase inhibitors for breast cancer again. And this is basically glucocorticoid induced osteoporosis. So again, so your post-transplant patients also, denosumab is a good drug to use, right? So how is it administered? It's a very simple and convenient administration. It is given in the dose of 60 milligram every 6 monthly as a subcutaneous injection, right? And just like it's a pre-filled syringe, it's very easy to administer. And of course, along with that, you need to give adequate calcium and vitamin D supplementation. Now they said 1000 and 400, I would rather suggest 1200 and 800 international units of vitamin D and calcium. Again, the contraindication of course is hypocalcemia. So if the patient is already having hypocalcemia, do not give it. And of course, pregnancy and known hypersensitivity to denosumab. Of course, I never had any patient come with this history. The clinical evidence comes from the FREEDOM trial, which is basically a large trial of more than 7,000 patients. And this patient, basically they looked at the risk of new vertebral and non-vertebral hip fractures. And they clearly, again, there was a statistically significant reduction in both the new vertebral and non-vertebral fracture compared to placebo, right? So again, then there is a FREEDOM extension trial. Again, I'm not going into too much detail. The important question, of course, for you nephrologists is to ask whether it is safe in patients and with CKD, and up to stage 4 CKD, there are trials done, and renal function has no significant impact on the pharmacokinetics and dynamics of this drug. So it's very safe. It can be given in patients with chronic kidney disease without any dose adjustment, right? So it can be used in any GFR, whereas the other drugs, right, especially the bisphosphonate, there is a GFR criteria which is to be kept in mind. Okay, so yeah, again, these are more data to suggest the safety of this drug in CKD. Okay. Right, so again, post-transplant patient also. So post-transplant patient, remember, a lot of these patients would be on steroids for a long time. So glucocorticoids will be given, and again, glucocorticoids given for a long time produces the risk of osteoporosis. So again, these patients, again, there's data now available for use of denosumab in post-transplant osteoporosis also, and again, it's found to be safe. Again, however, of course, you need to be watch for hypocalcemia. That's the only major concern. Otherwise, it's a very safe drug to be used in patients with post-transplant also. Okay. Yeah. We'll come to the discuss. So, in general, when you see a patient with GFR more than 30, you can treat the patient like usual osteoporosis. So again, in this case, your options would be either giving teriparatide or denosumab, or you can give your zoledronate or other bisphosphonate. Again, I generally prefer denosumab because of the convenience, the major factor. It's a very convenient drug to use, right? When GFR is less than 30, oral bisphosphonate, some of them can be given, raloxifene can be given, and denosumab. These are the only agents which are safe to be used in GFR less than 30. And zoledronate is contraindicated when GFR is less than 35. So again, this is something a lot of nephrologists are also well aware. Okay, and denosumab can be used up to GFR of 15 to 30 also. Only thing is, of course, if you have, especially patients on dialysis, if there are any, or CKD patients in general, hypocalcemia is something you should watch out for. And again, adequate calcium and vitamin D supplementation should be given to all of these patients. And of course, CKD MPD needs to be ruled out before starting treatment. So again, you would consider doing a biochemical testing. Again, remember, always do a calcium, PTH, vitamin D, alkaline phosphatase in all of these patients before you start treatment, because you need to rule out secondary causes and some other, the CKD MPD itself needs to be ruled out before starting treatment. Again, the dose in CKD is also same as in a non-CKD patient, that is 60 milligram, subcutaneously given every 6 months. Right? What you can do is, what you measure every 3 to 4 months, you measure again the calcium, phosphorus, vitamin D, and PTH levels in these patients, on treatment every 3 to 4 months. And first, at least once you should measure it within 2 weeks of starting treatment. So I generally call the patient back after 2 weeks, or I ask the patient to do these reports and send by WhatsApp after starting the denosumab therapy. Right? Again, important point is that denosumab should not be used, because the problem with denosumab is that, see, there is one difference between denosumab and zoledronate or other bisphosphonate. Bisphosphonate, they become part of the bone. So even if you stop the therapy, the effect will still remain. That's the advantage of bisphosphonate. The problem with denosumab is that denosumab, as soon as it is stopped, the patient goes back to the baseline risk. That is, if the patient already had a high risk of fracture, the patient, if the patient misses the dose, the patient again becomes a high risk of fracture. So again, something we should be told to your patient is that denosumab should not be stopped, right? Once it is given, it should be given at a regular 6 monthly basis, and the dose should not be missed. And again, most of the companies, including the originator and the biosimilars, have been very helpful, because most of their field staff, they help the patient to maintain compliance, so as to prevent the non-compliance in these group of patients. Currently, of course, the only challenge is that we have data of 10 years for denosumab, safety data. But of course, you have extension studies going on. And by the time, your patient completes 10 years of therapy, if you initiate the patient now, 10 years later, you'll have 10 years more data. So I think it's going to be, already you have ongoing extension trial. And there's absolutely no reason why. There is no cancer signals, nothing really to suggest that this could have any long-term adverse effects. So again, it's a safe drug to be used in long time. Now, denosumab we also use very frequently off-label, right? So you often use off-label therapy. We use it in severe hypercalcemia. In fact, several patients I think we have where we have, so hypercalcemia because of any etiology. Generally, of course, most of the patients who come to us are having primary hyperparathyroidism, but sometimes they could have malignancy-associated hypercalcemia, or sometimes they could have vitamin D toxicity, many other reasons. So whenever you have some hypercalcemia, severe hypercalcemia, patient admitted, denosumab is an excellent drug. It takes a little time to act, so it takes about 2 to 3 days for act, but it has a brilliant action. The calcium remains stable for almost 3-4 months. So it's a very good drug to use in patients with severe hypercalcemia. In fact, it is now approved for cancer, malignancy-associated hypercalcemia. Denosumab is an approved therapy, so you can use it in this group of patients. It's a FDA-approved indication. It's also useful for medical management of patients with primary hyperparathyroidism. We also use cinacalcet to lower the calcium, but cinacalcet does not have any bone protective action, and cinacalcet is a loose cannon, so sometimes you can develop more problems. But denosumab is a very useful drug in patients with primary hyperpara for some reason who cannot be operated. So for example, patient has high cardiovascular risk, or some patient doesn't want to get operated, certain other reasons. In such cases, you can consider using denosumab in this group of patients. Okay, so let me summarize and give you some take-home messages. So like we discussed, BMD DEXA may not be completely reliable in patients with CKD. History of a fragility fracture is the sine non of osteoporosis in patient with CKD. So if a patient has history of fracture, that almost certainly suggests the patient is having osteoporosis. It's important to rule out, of course, chronic CKD, MBD before starting treatment for osteoporosis and CKD, and PTH and bone specific alkaline phosphatase are useful to ruling out CKD, MBD. GFR more than 30, treat osteoporosis as we usually do. It's between 15 to 30, consider treating if the patient has history of fragility fracture. Oral bisphosphonate, raloxifene, denosumab are drugs which can be used when you have 15 to 30. Of these, the most effective, of course, is denosumab, without a doubt. And GFR less than 15, generally, we do not treat unless the patient has compelling reason to do so. Denosumab is generally given in the dose of 60 milligrams subcutaneous every 6 months. You need to monitor the calcium of the patient while on denosumab, and first at least repeat a calcium after 10 to 15 days after starting therapy. And treatment is generally given for 10 years because you have safety data for 10 years, right? So this is the overall thing, right? Again, now if you're very much interested in endocrinology, we have an app which is called Notes in Endocrinology app. This is available. You can use this QR codes, or you can search your it's available both on iOS as well as Android. So you can search the stores, respective stores for that. You can download this, freely available, free for download. We have lots of notes in various topics in endocrinology. Most importantly, it's very easy to read. It's in a question answer format, very similar to the talks I give. So it's very simple to understand, right? And a lot of things you can learn out of it, I hope. It's also available for if you're using a desktop, you can go to endocrinology.co.in for the same notes. So it's available free of charge, right? So you can have a look, and if you're more interested, I will be uploading a talk, this talk, as well as we'll be uploading some notes on CKD, MBD also on this very soon, within a couple of days. So please watch out for this. So I thank you for a patient listening, and you can open this for discussion.